History is written by the winners. From the 17th to 20th century, there were no greater winners than the nations of Europe. By the end of the 1800s, Europe had gone from the backwater of the Old World, fighting amongst itself, wallowing in plague and serfdom, to the home of the greatest empires the world has ever seen, with almost every other inhabited continent being near fully controlled by Europeans at some point. The massive success of this continent can be almost completely attributed to the earth-shattering wave that was industrialization. The landscape of Europe metamorphosized from rural fields to towering factories. Wagons became trains, paths of dirt became roads of pavement, and blades became rifles. Before this wave, the global balance of power sat not with Europe, but with the mighty empire of China. For thousands of years, China stood as the undisputed hegemon of the globe. The rest of the world fought amongst themselves for the ability to simply trade with the Empire of the Orient. But as Europe industrialized, China stagnated, until the Europeans were able to themselves force China into submission. The 1800s are known in Europe as the century of great empires and prosperity. In China, they are known as the century of humiliation. But this course was not unavoidable. There was one man who dreamed of a different fate. One of the last emperors of China who almost brought the empire from a declining force to a modern industrial power, capable of once again dominating the globe. So today we ask, what if he had succeeded? But first, a little more context. When Emperor Guangxu ascended to the Dragon Throne in 1875 at the ripe old age of 4, China was in a tough spot. Famines had ravaged the countryside throughout the century, killing tens of millions of people. The Qing dynasty had spent the past decades barely stamping out massive rebellions against their rule, and when they weren't doing that, they were being consistently humbled by European empires. In the First and Second Opium Wars, Europe had trounced the Chinese navy, taken coastal cities as tribute, and forced unequal trade deals upon the empire. In response to being clearly outmatched by the far further advanced Europeans, Chinese bureaucrats dug in their heels and resisted any changes that could threaten their power. The most influential of which being Empress Dowager Cixi, who had chosen the young Guangxu to ascend to the throne so she could act as regent and leader of China until he was old enough to assume the role. A large portion of the Qing military still fought with spears and bows, and the rest that did adopt modern military tactics and technologies splintered into independent armies that had more allegiance to their generals than the government, an issue that was also present in the Navy. This lack of cohesion made it hard to mount any kind of meaningful resistance against invading powers, leaving China vulnerable and at the whim of foreign nations. As the young Guangxu aged, he gained a fascination with the modernized nations of Europe, particularly with their technologies. Once the emperor was old enough to assume full control over China, he channeled this interest into an effort to modernize the nation. This effort, however, was rather haphazard and didn't bring about much. This haphazard attitude would soon change, however, when China was once again beaten, not by a European power, but by a fellow Asian one. Japan in the latter half of the 1800s had been undergoing one of the most explosive industrializations and modernizations the world had ever seen. Come 1894, and it was looking to expand its influence at the expense of China, wishing to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, which had traditionally been under Chinese protection. This culminated in the First Sino-Japanese War, during which the modernized Japanese army and navy dominated the Chinese. This was the final straw. Following this embarrassing defeat, Emperor Guangxu began the 100 Days Reform, a complete overhaul and modernization of Chinese society. This reform, however, was stopped dead in its tracks when the Chinese conservatives, led by Cixi, launched a coup against the emperor. With support from General Yuan Shikai, the coup successfully took power away from the emperor and into the hands of Cixi, ending the 100 Days Reform. In this alternate timeline, Emperor Guangxu promises Yuan Shikai complete control over a modernized and unified army. Such a deal would put an immense amount of power in Shikai's hands, but it would also secure his loyalty. When Cixi attempts to launch her coup, she is swiftly defeated and executed. It is now that the 100 Days Reform would truly begin to ramp up. Railways are constructed all throughout the nation. Chinese industrial companies, based off of Japanese and Western ones, are financially supported, spurring on mass industrialization. Yuan Shikai, head of the newly formed Grand Imperial Army, defeats independent and disloyal generals, consolidating the army. The navy is forced to follow suit, consolidating into a cohesive force. Conservative administrators are replaced with reformist loyalists, enforced by the powerful army. Outdated feudal systems, such as the imperial examination, which limited social mobility, are abolished. China is changing. However, if we want these changes to be allowed to happen, we need to buy China time. It would have to play appeaser to the European powers if this fledgling industrialization was to truly metamorphosize the nation. In our timeline, the Qing backed an anti-European organization within their borders known as the Boxers, who had been killing foreign missionaries and diplomats. When the Europeans sent troops into China to destroy the Boxers, the Qing attempted to fight them off. They lost, and were further subjugated by the foreigners as punishment. In this timeline, the Qing allow the foreign powers to quell the Boxers. At the expense of their prestige and sovereignty, they would avoid the ire of the foreign powers. By 1904, China is once again a player within its own territory. Come the Russo-Japanese War, and the Qing take the opportunity to finally strike back against one of its oppressors, seizing Russian infrastructure in Manchuria. The Sino-Russian War is a minor victory, asserting Chinese control over their own territory. Come 1914, the Chinese army is a cohesive force that sees the opportunity that World War I would bring. German Qingdao is seized in the war before the Japanese can attempt to take the city and surrounding peninsula. The rest of the war would see the Chinese industry boom as they supply the Entente powers with manufactured weaponry. World War I would play out mostly the same as it did in our timeline, with Germany losing in 1918. The Qing Empire seizes upon the weakness of Russia during the Russian Civil War to invade Outer Manchuria, reincorporating it into the empire. After the war, China's economy would be hit with the same post-war recession that plagued Japan and many other nations following World War I. Then, with the onset of the Great Depression, financial insecurity and unrest would become widespread, especially from democratic forces. China would adopt a new constitution, creating an elected parliament headed by a Grand Imperial Minister. Most of the body, including the Grand Minister, would be ethnically Han, appeasing Chinese nationalists. The emperor would be relegated to a figurehead, with the Guangxu Emperor being the last emperor with real power. The emperors would also become more and more of mythical figures, like the Emperor of Japan. China would politically quite resemble Japan, in fact. Nationalist political parties would be the largest, the military would hold extensive power, and the emperors would be an elusive and mystical figure. By the 1930s, Chinese-Japanese tensions would rapidly intensify, as the Japanese army wished to expand, seeing China as the biggest thing standing in their way. This time, however, things would be different. When war would finally break out, the Chinese army would push the Japanese out of Korea, reinstating the Joseon dynasty as a puppet government. Whether or not Chinese naval forces could beat the Japanese at the outset of the war, China could outproduce the Japanese, eventually coming out on top and retaking Taiwan, reasserting themselves as Asia's predominant power. Come the Second World War, and China would have eyes on the remaining European influences and territories within its sovereign lands. During the war, China would begin undoing the unequal treaties forced upon it in the 1800s, retaking control over their own trade. After the fall of France at the hands of the Nazis, China would make its final play to finally rid themselves of European influence, invading Vietnam and seizing European ports. Being in no position to defend against China in India, and with China most likely satisfied with the reassertion of their independence and sovereignty over their territory, Britain rescinds all unequal treaties and cedes all lands taken from China to avoid war. The United States eventually intervenes in World War II to prevent complete Soviet domination over Europe, and alongside Britain liberates Italy and France. However, with the later entry into the war, all of Germany falls under Soviet occupation. At the outset of the Cold War, China finds itself aligned with the United States against the Communist Soviet Union. With the increased globalization of the economy, China's manufacturing industry would soar, quickly becoming the third largest economy behind America and the Soviet Union, and growing quickly. As their economy would rapidly rise, America would begin seeing China as a rival, just as they saw Japan in the late 1900s when Japan's economy was rapidly on the rise in our timeline. A sort of Sino-American split would occur. However, I believe with such a massive population, China would have no issue overtaking the United States as the #1 economic and even military power. All of East Asia would fall into the economic influence of China. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Central Asia would follow, then Africa, and even Europe would become an economic battleground of a new Cold War between China and America. This is obviously a very optimistic scenario. Think of it as a best case for what could have been. History is a fickle thing. The great powers of one century can become the biggest losers of the next. But with one simple change, a great power can remain in or even come back to prominence. Who knows what would have truly happened if China industrialized in the 1800s, but perhaps it could have once again brought the world to its knees.